I was helping settle the final loose ends of my grandmother's estate when a credit monitoring alert I'd set up years earlier and honestly forgotten about flagged a hard inquiry on her social security number. My grandmother had been dead for 3 years. Someone had just applied for a new credit card using her identity, and when I finally pulled her full credit report to understand what was happening, I discovered 11 open accounts, all opened after her death, all traced back to my own sister. My name is Melissa, and this is the story of discovering that my sister had spent 3 years running an entire secret financial life through our dead grandmother's stolen identity, accumulating tens of thousands of dollars in debt under a dead woman's name. Debt that, as the estate's remaining executor, I was the one who eventually had to untangle. I want to explain my grandmother's specific significance in our family, because I think understanding that depth of meaning matters to understanding just how devastating this discovery ultimately became. My grandmother, Rose, had raised my sister Amanda and me for significant portions of our childhood, our own parents having gone through a genuinely difficult period involving my father's substance abuse struggles when we were young, a period during which our grandmother stepped in and provided the kind of stability and consistent care that shaped both of us profoundly throughout our formative years. My grandmother passed away 3 years ago, at 83, following a relatively brief illness. I served as the primary executor of her modest estate, a role I approached with genuine care given how much she'd meant to our entire family, working to properly close out her accounts, distribute her limited remaining assets according to her will, and ensure her financial affairs were handled with the same careful attention she'd always brought to managing our family's needs throughout her own life. I want to describe the specific administrative process I'd undertaken shortly after her death, understanding the importance, which I'd learned through some proactive research at the time, of formally notifying credit bureaus of a death to help prevent exactly the kind of identity theft that unfortunately sometimes targets deceased individuals' financial identities. I had submitted the necessary documentation to all three major credit bureaus, along with formally closing her known bank accounts and credit cards, believing I'd taken the appropriate, thorough steps to protect her identity and properly close out her financial affairs. I want to describe the specific credit monitoring service I'd also set up during this same period, a decision I'd made somewhat impulsively at the time, having read about the importance of ongoing monitoring even after formal death notification, given that these processes don't always perfectly immediately prevent all potential fraudulent activity. I want to be honest that I'd largely forgotten about this monitoring service in the years since, assuming, given my thorough initial notification process, that it represented simply an unnecessary additional precaution rather than something I expected to actually ever flag genuine activity. I received the alert that ultimately unraveled this entire devastating situation roughly 3 years after my grandmother's death, a routine notification email indicating a hard inquiry had been made on her credit file, the kind of inquiry that typically indicates someone has applied for new credit using the associated identity. I want to try to describe the specific, disorienting confusion of receiving this notification, genuinely believing, at first glance, that this must represent some kind of error or delayed processing artifact from years earlier, rather than an actual, current attempt to use my grandmother's identity for new credit applications 3 full years after her death. I logged into the monitoring service directly to investigate this alert more thoroughly, discovering, to my genuine shock, that this wasn't an isolated incident or processing error, but rather the most recent entry in what appeared to be an extensive, ongoing pattern of financial activity conducted under my deceased grandmother's identity throughout the entire 3-year period since her death. I want to describe the specific, sickening process of pulling my grandmother's complete credit report to fully understand the scope of what I was actually looking at, discovering 11 separate credit accounts that had been opened after her death, along with a pattern of regular activity, payments, and balance fluctuations suggesting these accounts had been actively, ongoingly used throughout this entire 3-year period, rather than representing some single, isolated fraudulent incident. I want to describe the specific, exhausting process of trying to understand who might actually be responsible for this extensive, sustained identity theft, initially assuming this represented some kind of external criminal fraud entirely unrelated to our own family. The kind of unfortunate but not entirely uncommon situation where deceased individuals' identities become targeted by organized identity theft operations. I want to describe the specific detail that first introduced genuine suspicion regarding my own sister's potential involvement, discovering, while reviewing the detailed billing addresses associated with several of these fraudulent accounts, that multiple statements had been mailed to an address I recognized immediately as Amanda's own current residence. I want to try to describe the specific, vertiginous shock of this discovery, understanding, in real time, that the person apparently responsible for 3 years of sustained identity theft against our own grandmother wasn't some anonymous external criminal, but my own sister, someone who had shared our grandmother's care and love throughout our entire childhood alongside me. I confronted Amanda directly roughly 2 days after this discovery, approaching the conversation with genuine, desperate hope that some innocent explanation might exist, understanding how devastating the alternative explanation would prove for both our family relationship and my grandmother's own memory and legacy. "I need to ask you something serious," I told her during this difficult conversation. "I found several credit accounts opened in Grandma's name after she died, with statements going to your address. I need you to tell me honestly what's happening." I want to describe watching my sister's face during this question, watching her initial attempt at confused denial slowly, inevitably crumble as I continued laying out the specific, undeniable documentation I'd already gathered regarding the accounts and their clear connection to her own address and, as I would soon learn, her own ongoing financial activity. Amanda's eventual confession, delivered through what became an increasingly emotional, complicated admission, revealed that she had, in fact, begun opening credit accounts using our grandmother's identity roughly 4 months after her death. Initially, according to her account, driven by genuine, severe financial desperation following a job loss and mounting medical debt from a health crisis she'd never fully disclosed to the rest of our family. "I know how this looks," she told me during this devastating conversation. "I was drowning, Melissa. I'd lost my job, I had medical bills I couldn't pay, and I remembered that Grandma's identity was still technically active in the system before you finished all the death notification paperwork. I told myself it would just be temporary, just until I got back on my feet. And then somehow it just kept going because I never actually got back on my feet the way I thought I would." I want to try to describe the specific, layered devastation of this explanation, understanding that Amanda's underlying financial crisis, while genuinely serious and deserving of compassion in its own right, never justified the specific, sustained choice to steal our deceased grandmother's identity, a woman who had raised us both with genuine, selfless love, now having her memory and financial identity actively exploited for years by one of the very people she'd sacrificed so much to care for. I want to describe the specific, exhausting scope of what Amanda had actually accumulated throughout this 3-year period, working with a specialized identity theft resolution service to fully understand and begin addressing the financial reality of what had occurred. The 11 accounts collectively carried an outstanding balance of just over $31,000, debt that, because it existed under my grandmother's identity rather than any legitimately recognized living debtor, created a genuinely complicated legal and administrative situation regarding how it could actually be formally resolved and closed. I want to describe the specific, difficult process of working with both a specialized attorney and the credit bureaus directly to formally document this situation as identity theft rather than legitimate debt, a process that required extensive documentation proving my grandmother's death predated all of these account openings, along with formal reports to relevant authorities regarding the fraudulent nature of this activity. I want to describe the specific, agonizing decision I faced regarding whether to formally report Amanda to law enforcement for what constituted, unambiguously, both identity theft and financial fraud, understanding the genuine legal seriousness of what she'd done, while simultaneously processing my own complicated love for my sister and awareness of the genuine financial desperation that had apparently initiated this entire situation, however inadequate that context ultimately proved as. Justification. I want to describe the extended, difficult family conversation that eventually took place, involving myself, Amanda, and our mother, working through both the practical question of how to formally resolve this fraudulent debt and the deeper, more painful question of how to process this specific betrayal of our grandmother's memory and identity. I ultimately decided, after extensive consultation with both my attorney and considerable personal reflection, not to pursue formal criminal charges against Amanda, a decision I reached with genuine, ongoing ambivalence. Understanding both the legitimate legal seriousness of what she'd done and my own complicated desire to address this situation in a way that might allow for eventual family healing rather than the kind of permanent rupture criminal prosecution would likely guarantee. I want to be honest that this decision hasn't been universally understood or supported by other family members, some of whom felt considerably more strongly that formal legal consequences were genuinely warranted given the scope and duration of what Amanda had actually done. Understanding her actions touched not simply an abstract financial crime, but a direct, sustained violation of our grandmother's actual memory and identity. I want to describe the specific, ongoing arrangement Amanda and I eventually established regarding the actual outstanding fraudulent debt, working with the credit bureaus to formally document and close these accounts as identity theft rather than legitimate debt, while Amanda agreed, separately, to a personal repayment arrangement with me directly, understanding that even though the debt itself would be formally resolved as fraud rather than legitimate obligation, some form of accountability and restitution felt important to establish given the genuine harm her actions had caused to our grandmother's financial legacy and our broader family trust. I want to describe my own complicated, ongoing process of processing this particular betrayal, understanding that unlike some forms of family financial harm that primarily affect living relationships and trust, this situation touched something considerably more unusual and, in its own way, more disturbing: the sustained exploitation of a deceased person's identity, someone who could never discover, object to, or defend against what was actually happening to her own name and financial legacy. It's been just over 8 months since that initial credit monitoring alert first revealed this entire 3-year deception. My relationship with Amanda remains genuinely strained, though we maintain functional, if considerably more guarded, contact, working through both the practical resolution of the fraudulent accounts and the much deeper question of how to process this specific violation of our grandmother's memory going forward. I think, often, about the specific, unsettling nature of this particular betrayal, understanding that my grandmother, throughout the final 3 years since her death, had been living an entirely fabricated financial existence she never consented to and could never have discovered or addressed herself, her actual legacy and memory quietly, persistently exploited by one of the very grandchildren she'd sacrificed so much to raise and protect throughout our difficult childhood. If you've ever discovered that a deceased loved one's identity had been exploited by someone within your own family, forcing you to navigate both the practical legal resolution and the deeper question of how to process betrayal of someone who can no longer speak for themselves, I want to hear how you found your way through that particular, unusual grief. I used to believe that death itself represented a kind of final, complete protection for a person's identity and legacy, that whatever vulnerabilities existed during someone's living years simply concluded, definitively, upon their passing. I've learned, in the most disturbing way possible, that even death doesn't fully protect us from the people closest to us, and that sometimes the deepest betrayals happen specifically because the person being harmed can never discover, object to, or defend against what's actually being done in their name.